So welcome to part 2 of this 3-part series. Yesterday we did the Americas tier list for Rostermania. Today we are doing EMEA. And remember, this tier list will be based on at least what I think is a realistic ideal for these teams and, judging it based off of that. So keep that in mind for where these teams end up in their tiers, and let's dive into it. And so let's dive in, and we'll start with our first team, which is Fnatic, which is a nice, easy one, because of course they're keeping their roster together. The only change, of course, is Mini wanting to step down, who it says here on the spreadsheet is likely to be an assistant coach still with the team, which I think is good in a way, but might cause some problems for whoever takes that head coaching job, because you've kind of still got Mini in there in the background. So it's like, how much do you want to force your ideas versus what was already, of course, working for Fnatic? Could be a bit of a thing, but obviously Fnatic keeping the roster together is obviously a big win. And so for Fnatic, I mean, you might say that it's a no-brainer to just, keep the roster together. Obviously, we'll have to see exactly who they get as their head coach, right? And we'll have to actually see how that plays out with, how many different ideas are they running, right? Does Fnatic look very different? Whoever the head coach is, right? So that will be an important point of this. So I'm going to put Fnatic in the A tier for that. I mean, I do want to give them a bit of credit for actually just keeping the roster together, because as we've seen with other orgs, e.g., that doesn't always happen, even if the team does pretty well. So I'm going to put Fnatic in the A tier, and obviously this will depend on who exactly their head coach is. Okay, next up is Giants Gaming, who also had a forced change, that they couldn't really have anything to do with, because Rhyme retired from pro play, which means they have to bring in someone else. And here on the spreadsheet, it says Redgar. Now, it also has Cloud as the IGL here. That to me would be very, very weird if you make Cloud the IGL. That's not weird in and of itself necessarily, but then bring in Redgar, right? Like, if you are going to make Cloud the IGL, surely there's a better option than Redgar. Surely you just want to find someone who's a cracked, smokes player or whatever you feel like you need. Like, surely that would make more sense. If Redgar comes in and is the IGL, I think that also makes sense. But bringing in Redgar but having Cloud IGL, I think it would be a very bizarre move. Also, I just want to note that here on the spreadsheet as well, Giants are partnering with UCAM Tokias, who I think are another Spanish org, and I like that, right? I like these pro teams who are partnering with others. In the Americas, there wasn't anyone confirmed. It just said that, some of the South American teams were looking for partner teams. I think that's a good thing, because it means that team that the tier 1 team partners with is more likely to stay in the scene, right? If they're partnered with a tier 1 org, they're just more likely to be in the scene, which is obviously a good thing. So I appreciate the orgs who are doing that kind of thing. I think that's obviously a good thing for just the scene in general. And so, yeah, good on Giants. In terms of their, keeping everything together and, potentially bringing in Redgar. Again, if Redgar is IGLing, I don't mind it too much. Keeping this roster together, again, I think is fine. Obviously they made it to champs. Maybe they're hoping that, with a bit more time, this team can really gel and potentially even go on to greater heights. And so for that, I'm going to put Giants in the B tier. Okay, next up is Esports, who have made a couple changes. They got rid of Moj, and they also don't have Kiwi either, of course, but it looks like they're bringing in CNET and bringing in a tier 2 player as well. I don't know quite how you say this name yet. Yetuje? Don't know, but a tier 2 Turkish player, and of course, CNET keeping everything else the same. So just quickly looking at Yetuje's stats here, you can see that he's a Sentinel player, so probably a one-to-one direct replacement for Moj, and, looks pretty good. Like, the stats here, I don't know much about him, I'll be honest, was from Fireflux, who were a decent team last year, and yeah, looks like a pretty decent player. And of course, everyone knows about CNED, and bringing in CNED is a good pickup for FUT. Obviously, you are losing Kiwi, who is also a very, very good player, and I think the ideal for FUT really would have been to bring in both. I know that people will say, well, they play the same role, what do you mean? But to me, again, when it comes to roster construction and things like this, roles be damned, right? People can learn new agents, just get good players. That would be my philosophy when it comes to building a roster. You can figure roles out and people can, learn extra stuff. We've seen it, plenty of times before. Mako used to be a duelist. Now he's the best smokes player in the world. You can learn other roles, right? Especially given some time. And so just get good players would always be my thing. But bringing in CNED pretty good. And their, new player Yetiye as well looks like a decent player. And so for FUT, I think I'm going to put them in the high B tier. You might make a case for low A tier here for FUT. But for me, you bring in CNED, lose Kiwi, that's kind of almost like a cancel out. Again, my ideal would have been to see both of those players on the same roster, because I think that would have been, 1, very hype, and 2, probably pretty good. But yeah, don't mind what they've done so far. Okay, next up is Team Liquid, who have made some changes for sure. They're keeping the coaching staff. They still have Yampy, they still have Nets, but everyone else is gone. Redgar, Safe, Soulcast, all gone, and they're bringing in essentially Apex, or an Apex core with Kaiko, Enzo, and Mystic here. Mystic, not as certain. Maybe it still could be someone else, but Enzo and Kaiko, it looks like, are coming in. Enzo being the new IGL for this team. And this one, look, I think is a decent pickups, right? We've seen Enzo, we've seen Mystic. If they do get Mystic at like the highest levels of the game, they've been to international events before with Fnatic, and did decently well in some of those international events. So that's not necessarily a problem for me, and I think obviously the Apex team did very well for most of last year. Kaiko, obviously a bit more unknown at the very top level, but again, was a very good duelist for Apex last year. So we'll see how that translates. The thing is, for me, like, I don't mind these pickups, but the question I asked at my Twitch chat a couple days ago was, is this better than the Team Liquid roster from last year? And a lot of people were like, it's probably kind of maybe the same. That was the response that most people gave, and I'd be interested to hear your, response to that in the comments down below as well. And I think I kind of agree. Like, it kind of just feels like, yeah, it's maybe about the same, which is like, I don't know. It just feels like Team Liquid, could have maybe been, a team to challenge Fnatic. Obviously, they are a very big org, but it kind of feels like we've just kind of maybe taken a sideways step rather than really trying to push it. I think if I had to guess, this team will probably end up on a similar level overall to Team Liquid of this year, but will probably have lower heights, but definitely higher floors, right? So they won't be as bad as they were at lock-in at any point, I don't think, this roster, but I don't think maybe they'll be like EMEA champions either, right? And so for that with Team Liquid, I think I'm going to give them a low B tier. Well, yeah, like it's okay. It's not like they brought in some, players who I don't think are very good. They're bringing in players who I do think are pretty good. But I just feel like, there was maybe potential there to, really like be like, okay, we are going to challenge you, Fnatic. Watch this, right? And I'm just not quite sure if this roster is quite there, but I'm willing to be surprised. Okay, on to Koi, who have kept their coaching staff. They've kept Trex, Starkso, and Shados. On the spreadsheet here, it seems that there is a duelist debate between Alive from Ascend and Tomazi from Saw from Portugal, who are both very good duelists. And I'm, again, surprised that both of them are kind of on this sheet, like in a lot of different areas, because I think they're both like tier 1 level duelists. I mean, Alive, I was watching him play yesterday, and Alive is definitely a tier 1 duelist. Let me put it to you that way. With some of the things that he does, he's just insane. I kind of hope that he doesn't, because, that's good for Ascend, my org, but, I do think Alive deserves it. And then there's Trials, and they need an IGL, right? And that's going to be the big question for Koi, is who's IGL in this team? Because, apparently Cold Dementor is out, and there aren't many, like, known, like, like up-and-coming IGLs who it's, like, obvious who you should pick up. So that's going to be, like, a big question here for Koi in terms of, how this roster ends up looking. But I don't mind necessarily, like, keeping the core that they did keep, I think was good. And I think, considering the performance last year, maybe they did need an IGL change as well. So maybe that makes sense. So I actually don't mind some of the moves they've made. And so assuming that they do get one of Tomazi or Alive, who I think are very good players, and I did think that they needed some amount of change, I think I'm going to put Koi in the low A tier, because I think I still have faith in the core that they've kept. And so I still think that that's a decent idea. And so, yeah, I'm going to put them in low A. Now, obviously, Karmine Core from, where we were last year, they needed big changes, and they are making big changes. Pretty much everyone is out, right? The only person who's here on the sheet that was there last year is Shin, and apparently that's in a trial phase, so not even, like, definitely on the roster. Things that they have done, though, is they've got Eng, who's the former Gambit coach, a former Masters winner with Gambit, which obviously I think is a very good pickup in general. They brought Magnum, who used to play for Apex and Fnatic, and they've got Martin, who used to play for GMT, who are an Italian tier 2 team, and I really like Martin, and I really liked GMT because they played a ton of Yoru, and I just appreciated them for playing a ton of Yoru, and Martin was a pretty decent player there for GMT as well, so I don't mind that pickup either. Obviously, the rest of the roster, as you can see on the sheet there, is still very much up in the air, but I think overall, just with the kind of direction they've gone, they clearly realized, like, hey, we need to just reset. And, maybe this whole French speaking thing, maybe there just isn't enough talent to make like a good team. We tried it, didn't work. Now let's go international, pick up a head coach with, a lot of experience and, a good record before, and some players as well that I think, are good starting pieces as well. I like the direction of this Karmine Corp team. And so for that, I think, again, Karmine Corp, they needed to fully reset. I'm going to put them in high A tier. It's difficult to put them in S tier when, there's still 3 roster positions up in the air. But in terms of what they, I think, needed to do, yeah, I honestly don't mind going for a full reset, hit the, big red button, blow it all up, and just start afresh and go from there. And I think that, they've started with some decent pieces as well. So I like what they're doing so far. Okay, Team Vitality, who have pretty much, I think, fully confirmed their roster at this point. They did get rid of a couple players, and they brought in Runner, Safe, and Kicks. They kept the coaching staff the same. They keep Destrian and Sender from the old roster. There are some parts of this that I'm not totally in love with, right? I think that Molzy is a great player, and I think Molzy is definitely a tier 1 player, and I probably would have said keep Molzy if it was up to me, but they decided to go in a bit of a different direction. I think maybe that's because Safe, said he wants to play initiators. I guess Safe is probably going to pick up a similar role to Molzy. Again, if that was me, I'd just say get good players, teach them a new role, figure the rest out later on. Whatever, but okay, bringing in Safe, obviously that's a great pickup in general. I think that's just a good pickup. But Safe is a very, very good player of this video game, so that's good. And Runner and Kicks as well. Runner I did watch last year because he was in the same league as Ascend, so I did watch some of his games, and he's a good player. He's a duelist player who, yeah, is pretty good. So I assume Safe is going to take that initiator role, and Runner will be on that duelist role. And Kicks, I don't know as much about because he was in the German league, but just looking at some of his stats, also seems to be a pretty good player as well, statistically speaking. I can't speak to actually how the gameplay, the eye test, but it looks like a decent start. It's not my perfect kind of roster, I think, and there is some IGL questions here as well, where I don't think anyone on this team has like full-time IGL'd before, but I could be wrong about that. So there is still some questions there. I think Destrian is likely going to become the IGL of this team, but we'll see how it goes. And so for Vitality, I don't fully agree with everything they've done. I think they should have kept Molzy. We'll have to, with the IGL is still a question as well. Obviously, bringing in Safe is a massive win, so I think I'm going to put them at the highest B tier. You could easily make a case for them being low A tier, but I think it's going to be probably a decent chance here for Vitality to be a pretty decent team. Okay, moving on to NaVi. Very easy one here. They did the thing that everyone thought they would do. They, got rid of CNED, brought back Artists, we're running it back with the old FPX, and yeah, there isn't really much else to say about this one. And this one might look a little bit weird, but when you think about like how I'm doing this tier list, I think NaVi have to go in S tier. Like, what was the other ideal for NaVi? Bringing back Artists just makes the most sense, right? So I'm just gonna put them in S tier because that probably was their ideal. Gentl Mates, very simple one. They're just keeping it all the same, which I obviously appreciate. Again, all these players who, earned their way into tier 1 are getting a chance to play in tier 1, which is good. And so for Gentl Mates, I don't really know. I guess I'll put them next to Fnatic, where, you just kept it the same. So like in A tier here, right? You kept it the same. You rewarded all the players who got you there. Yeah, put them in A tier. Then on to Team Heretics, who have made some big changes. They keep Boo and they keep Benji from the end of last year as well. And they bring in Mini Boo, who's Boo's brother, Woot and Rienz from the tier 2 Turkish scene as well. And honestly, I kind of like this direction, okay? Do I expect Team Heretics with this roster to be like super, super competitive and, winning every game? No, right? I wouldn't expect Team Heretics to even finish in the top half, but this is a pretty young team now who, if I'm building a team, I'm looking at who's been the best team building, team in Valorant thus far, and I would say it's been Fnatic. And how did Fnatic build their team? Well, what they did is they started off with just, a group of players, and then they kept the ones that they liked, and then they replaced the others, right? And they just went through iterations of rosters, right? So it started with Boaster and Durka, let's say, and then, in came Alfia, and then in the next roster, it was, we bring in Leo and Chronicle, right? And eventually you end up with a super team. And I think Heretics, this kind of building where we start off young, right? We start off, and maybe this is like a year, an extra year project, right? Where we're going to keep this roster and we're just going to see like, okay, who's good from this roster? Get rid of anyone who's not good, keep the ones who play well, and then just go from there, right? And I think that that's a decent way of starting it. And it seems like there's a plan here, right? That's what I like, is that, there seems to be a pretty clear direction with what Heretics are trying to do. And so for Heretics then, I like that there's a direction, but I still think there is question marks here, and I don't think that this team will be, you know, super successful, particularly early on in the season. So for that, I think I'm going to put them in the high B tier for at least having a direction. And then finally, BBL, who have kept Kushner and they kept Brave. They bring in 3 other Turkish players who played for various tier 2 Turkish teams last year. Pora actually has been on BBL before and is now coming back to IGL, the team. And so we've ended up again with a full Turkish squad. Obviously, I would say as soon as it was kind of rumored that, you know, Kiwi wasn't going to be on foot, I would say to BBL, like, hey, do you want to go and sign Kiwi? He's pretty good. Hey, that's a pretty good Turkish player right there you could sign. And it's not that the players that they brought in, you know, won't be good necessarily, but, you know, there is always going to be that question of, hey, Kiwi proved it last year that he's a very, very good player, and, you know, he was potentially available to go and get. And so for BBL, I'm going to put them in the C tier. That might seem a bit harsh because they're kind of there on their own. But the reason is basically because of that Kiwi thing, right? Like, you know, the ideal here is, hey, if Kiwi isn't playing for FUT, go and sign Kiwi, right? He's an absolutely insane Turkish player that will definitely make your team better. And obviously BBL were a team that struggled last year, so I don't mind, like, you know, some of the changes that they've made and that they are making changes. That's good at least. But I think, you know, there's such an obvious, like, staring you in the face, like, please make this change. And I don't know if they were involved in kind of, you know, the CNED sweepstakes as well, but that seems like another one where, hey, you've missed out, right, on CNED, who was available, who, you know, you could have got, and hey, maybe you're like the premier Turkish team. But for me, it feels like BBL are pretty clearly behind FUT in terms of, you know, those 2 Turkish teams. And so that was the tier list, and I think when it comes to EMEA teams, you know, a lot of them are making moves that make sense, right? Like, you know, little tweaks here and there for most of these rosters that, yeah, kind of just make sense. I think a lot of these EMEA teams have approached this in the kind of right direction. And so that's my tier list for EMEA. Tomorrow will be Pacific, so keep an eye out for that, because Pacific is pretty juicy.